Welcome back to Sherlock's Shadow, where every story is a mystery waiting to be solved. I'm your host, and today, we're exploring another exciting case from the world of Miss Marple. Isn't it amazing how stories bring us together, no matter where we are? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? I read every single comment. Now let's get started. Miss Marple and the Secrets of Sycamore Lane, Chapter 1. Death at Forsyth Manor. The clock had only just struck 10 when the silence of Forsyth Manor was shattered by the panicked cries of Maggie Hewitt. "He's dead! Mr. Forsyth is dead!" "Inspector!" Harrow stepped over the threshold into the dimly lit study. Henry Forsyth, the man who had spent a lifetime untangling the affairs of others, now lay slumped over his desk. A cup of tea sat beside him, its contents only half drunk. Papers, neat and orderly, remained undisturbed except for a single sheet at the very center, where Forsyth's stiffened fingers still rested. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly in the corner of the drawing room where the household had been gathered, tilted her head. "Poison, I should think," she murmured under her breath. The inspector, oblivious to the elderly lady's musings, straightened. "Maggie Hewitt, you were the first to find him?" The housekeeper, pale and shaking, nodded. "I brought in his evening papers as usual." The door was unlocked, but she hesitated, swallowing. "He was like this, sir, just sitting there, not moving. His tea had spilled a little on the saucer." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the tea set. The cup was barely touched, but the sugar bowl had a strange, uneven texture to it. A minor thing, but odd nonetheless. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat. "When was the last time anyone saw Mr. Forsyth alive?" Maggie clutched her apron. "At supper, sir. I brought in his tray around 7. He liked to eat alone in here. I went to clear it at 8:30, but he told me not to disturb him, said he had work to do." The inspector turned to Dr. Lionel Graves, who had been summoned the moment. "The body was found. Time of death?" Dr. Graves adjusted his cufflinks, his voice clipped. "Judging by the rigidity, I'd say somewhere between 8 and 9:30. A more precise estimate will require an autopsy." Miss Marple watched the physician keenly. A careful man, measured in his words, but there was a tightness in his jaw as he spoke. "'Cause of death?" The inspector pressed. Dr. Graves hesitated. "Difficult to say just yet, but—" He glanced at the teacup, then at Forsyth's ashen face. "There are signs that suggest poisoning." A murmur ran through the room. Maggie gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Poison? But I never—" "No one is accusing you," Harrow interrupted. "Not yet." His gaze swept the room. Was there anything unusual in Mr. Forsyth's manner today? Maggie hesitated. He was troubled. He received a letter earlier in the day. Seemed upset about it. "A letter?" Harrow's brows lifted. "Where is it?" "I don't know, sir," Maggie admitted. "He must have kept it in his study." The inspector turned his attention to the desk. The papers were neatly stacked, except for the single sheet beneath Forsyth's lifeless hand. He gently eased it out and scanned the contents. A single sentence had been scrawled across the page in shaky, urgent handwriting. "If I die before morning, the truth lies in the Graves case." Silence fell over the room. Miss Marple, who had been listening attentively, finally spoke. "That would be a reference to Dr. Graves' father, would it not?" All eyes turned to the doctor. A flicker of something passed over his face, quickly masked. "It's an old case," he said evenly. "Irrelevant now. But not perhaps to Mr. Forsyth," Miss Marple said gently. The inspector gave Graves a hard look. "I'll be the judge of what's relevant, doctor. What was your father's connection to Forsyth?" Dr. Graves exhaled sharply. "Years ago, my father was accused of falsifying medical reports. Forsyth was the solicitor involved, but the case never went to trial." He squared his shoulders. "But that was the past. My father is dead." I fail to see why Forsyth would concern himself with it now. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps because he meant to set things right. Dr. Graves' lips thinned. I had nothing to do with Forsyth's death. I barely spoke to him these past months. And yet, Miss Marple mused, one wonders why his final words should name your family. A muscle twitched in the doctor's jaw, but he said nothing. Inspector Harrow, clearly unsettled, turned back to Maggie. Who else had access to this room tonight? No one, sir. He never let anyone in while he worked. And the tea? Did you prepare it? No, sir. He preferred to make it himself when working late. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Then, the poison could not have been added after the tea was made. It must have already been there. A sharp silence followed. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. I believe we should examine the sugar. Harrow gave her a skeptical look. And why would we do that? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her gaze was unwavering. Because, Inspector, if Mr. Forsyth always prepared his own tea, then the poison must have been waiting for him long before the kettle was ever boiled. For the first time, Harrow hesitated. He motioned to an officer. Bag the sugar bowl. I want it tested. Maggie let out a shaky breath. Dr. Graves remained impassive. Miss Marple, meanwhile, simply folded her hands in her lap. The case had only just begun, but already she had seen enough to know that this was not a simple matter. Of an old man's untimely death, someone had waited for this moment. Someone had planned it, and whoever had done it was standing in this very room. Chapter 2. The Housekeeper's Secret. Maggie Hewitt's hands trembled as she poured tea into 2 cups, the dark liquid swirling in the porcelain. Her usual steady demeanor was gone, replaced by an unmistakable nervousness. Miss Marple, seated across from her in the small, tidy kitchen of Forsyth Manor, observed this with quiet interest. The inspector had finished questioning the staff, and the house had settled into uneasy silence, but Miss Marple had stayed behind. You must forgive me, Maggie murmured, setting down the pot. It's just, her breath hitched. I can't believe he's really gone. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Mr. Forsyth was a difficult man, was he not? Maggie swallowed, glancing away. He had his ways. He kept to himself, but he wasn't cruel. Not always. Miss Marple tilted her head. Not always? The housekeeper's hands clenched around the edge of the table. There were times when he could be sharp, short-tempered, but he had his reasons. She hesitated, then said, almost to herself, I thought, after all these years, he might have changed his mind. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together. Changed his mind about what, my dear? Maggie's fingers tightened around her cup. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled shakily. About me. There was something in her voice, something heavy with unspoken sorrow. Miss Marple, ever patient, simply waited. Maggie's next words came quietly, as if she had carried them too long. I am his daughter. The confession hung between them, fragile and raw. Miss Marple did not react with shock, only a slight dip of her chin, as though she had already suspected it. I see, she said gently. And did he know? Maggie gave a small, bitter laugh. Oh, he knew. He always knew. She set her cup down with an unsteady clink. I was born in this village. My mother, Margaret Hewitt, was in service here before me. She was young, foolish. She thought he loved her. When she told him she was with child, he sent her away. Miss Marple nodded, her face unreadable. He never acknowledged me, Maggie continued, her voice tightening. Never so much as looked at me when I first came here as a maid, but I stayed, hoping, perhaps, that one day. She trailed off. Of course it was foolish. Miss Marple took a careful sip of tea. And yet, you remained in his employ. Maggie let out a tired sigh. What else was I to do? I had no family, no money. And he... Well, I thought perhaps deep down he did feel something. Even if he... would never say it. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. But something changed recently, didn't it? Maggie's fingers twisted in her lap. A week ago, I overheard him speaking with his solicitor. They were discussing his will. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Maggie's expression darkened. I had always assumed that, when he died, he would leave me something. Not because I wanted his money, but because, she swallowed, because it would have meant he acknowledged me. That I was his daughter. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And what did you hear? Maggie hesitated before answering. He told the solicitor he had made his final decision. He wasn't changing a thing. Her breath caught. I was cut out, completely. Miss Marple observed the flicker of pain in her eyes, the slight quiver of her lips. I wanted to confront him, Maggie admitted. I was so angry, but I told myself it wouldn't do any good. He was set in his ways. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And did you? Maggie hesitated. Yes, the next evening, I couldn't help myself. I asked him outright. Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the words to come. He looked at me, Maggie murmured. And do you know what he said? You were never meant to be my problem. Her jaw clenched. I left before I could say anything I'd regret. Miss Marple sat back, her gaze thoughtful. I didn't kill him, Maggie whispered. I was angry, yes. But I could never, she swallowed hard. He was my father, whether he admitted it or not. A silence stretched between them. Miss Marple finally spoke. Did Mr. Forsyth receive any visitors yesterday? Maggie frowned. No one unusual, just Dr. Graves in the afternoon. And Mr. Carroway, of course. Miss Marple's gaze flickered. Mr. Carroway? Maggie nodded. They argued. Quite loudly. In fact, I could hear it from the corridor. Miss Marple's fingers traced absent patterns along her teacup. Did you hear what it was about? Money, Maggie said without hesitation. Mr. Carroway wanted something from Mr. Forsyth, and he wasn't pleased with whatever answer he got. Miss Marple tucked this information away. The housekeeper hesitated, then leaned forward. There's something else. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. The day before he died, Mr. Forsyth received a letter. I don't know what it said, but it upset him greatly. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Do you know where the letter is? Maggie shook her head. He kept it with his papers, I think. But now, her voice trailed off as she realized the significance of what she was saying. The letter could very well have been the reason Forsyth was murdered. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on the table. If we find that letter, we may find his killer. Maggie's breath hitched. You think someone knew? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. If someone felt threatened by what Mr. Forsyth knew, they would have every reason to silence him. Maggie swallowed hard, her hands tightening in her lap. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. But her mind was already working. A man like Henry Forsyth had no shortage of enemies. But not just anyone would have known about that letter. Whoever had poisoned Forsyth's tea must have known exactly what he was about to reveal. And if Miss Marple was right, the answer to this mystery was still hidden somewhere in Forsyth Manor. She set her teacup down carefully. Her mind made up. It was time to start looking. Chapter 3. The physicians passed Miss Marple's arrival at Dr. Lionel Graves. Surgery was met with the faint scent of antiseptic and the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. The doctor himself stood behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, carefully stacking a set of patient records. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, his voice polite but cool. What brings you here? She smiled gently. I do hope I'm not disturbing you, doctor. It's just that Mr. Forsyth's passing has left so many unanswered questions. Dr. Graves let out a quiet sigh, rubbing his temple. Yes, a tragedy, of course. Though from what I gather, the inspector is treating it as something more deliberate. Miss Marple tilted her head. You believe otherwise? He met her gaze steadily. Poison is being suggested. I would know more than most how easy it is to misinterpret symptoms. Miss Marple nodded, knitting her hands together. Quite, though I do wonder, Doctor, what were your dealings with Mr. Forsyth? Dr. Graves stiffened slightly. Dealings? Oh yes, Miss Marple said lightly. You visited him the day before his death, I believe. There was the faintest hesitation before he answered. Routine visit. He had been suffering from occasional dizziness. A man of his age, you understand. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Strange, then, that I heard he was in excellent health otherwise. Dr. Graves' jaw tensed. Perhaps. But age creeps up on even the strongest of men. Miss Marple studied him for a moment before speaking again. Mr. Forsyth's final words mentioned something about the Graves case. That must have been a difficult thing to hear. Dr. Graves' grip on the papers in his hand tightened ever so slightly. I don't see why, he said briskly. It was an old matter, long forgotten. Miss Marple's smile remained, but her gaze was piercing. But not by Mr. Forsyth, evidently. Dr. Graves exhaled sharply and placed the papers down. What is it you're getting at, Miss Marple? She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Your father's name still carries weight in this village, does it not? People still whisper about the fraud case. Dr. Graves' expression darkened. Those whispers are baseless. My father was an honorable man. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm, and yet Henry Forsyth kept records of it. Tell me, Doctor, did he mention reopening the case? For the first time, there was something flickering behind Graves' composed expression. If he did, it was out of spite. I doubt he had any real intention. Miss Marple let the silence hang. Dr. Graves exhaled, his fingers drumming against the desk. Forsyth and my father, they were connected, yes. My father once provided him with medical reports for legal cases. There were allegations unfounded. I should add that some of those reports were, shall we say, adjusted. Adjusted? Dr. Graves' tone grew clipped. False, if you must put it plainly. But nothing was ever proven. Miss Marple nodded, watching him carefully. I can imagine that if Mr. Forsyth decided to revisit the case, it could have been quite inconvenient. Dr. Graves' voice was cold now. Are you implying that I had something to do with his death? Oh, not at all, dear doctor, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. I am simply considering all possibilities. After all, we do know he was poisoned, don't we? Dr. Graves said nothing, but his fingers twitched slightly against the desk. Miss Marple took a moment before continuing, her tone ever so casual. You must be quite familiar with belladonna, I imagine. Dr. Graves blinked. The moment was slight, but it was there. Belladonna? That's absurd. Oh, I merely ask out of curiosity, Miss Marple said smoothly. It's such a fascinating thing, poison. Hardly a common choice. Requires careful handling, expert knowledge. Dr. Graves' lips pressed into a thin line. Anyone with access to a garden or the right books could use it, Miss Marple. You don't need to be a doctor to understand it. Miss Marple nodded, accepting this, though she did not look convinced. No, I suppose not. She let the conversation linger for a moment longer. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a slip of paper. Oh, one last thing. The inspector came across this during his search of the village records. She slid the paper across the desk. Dr. Graves picked it up with a frown. It was a pharmacy receipt, a purchase made for a tincture of belladonna, and the signature at the bottom, L.G. Graves. Dr. Graves' face remained unreadable, but his grip on the paper had tightened. Miss Marple's voice was light when she spoke again. You do seem to have a rather recent interest in it. A long silence followed. Finally, Dr. Graves set the receipt down carefully. His expression was unreadable, but his tone, when he spoke, was level. A simple purchase, Miss Marple. For medicinal purposes. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Of course, doctor. She stood, gathering her handbag. Thank you for your time. You have been most helpful. Dr. Graves gave her a tight nod. "I trust you'll inform the inspector of my full cooperation." "Oh, naturally," Miss Marple said, heading for the door. She paused just before stepping out. "I do wonder, though," she mused. "If Mr. Forsythe was poisoned, then the question is, did the killer know exactly what they were doing? Or did they have help?" Dr. Graves said nothing. Miss Marple gave him a pleasant nod and left. As the door clicked shut behind her, Dr. Graves remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the pharmacy receipt in his hand. It was not the first time he had been questioned about his father's past, but this time he had the distinct impression it would not be the last. Chapter 4. A businessman's grudge. Flicks Carraway was not a man known for patience. His fingers drummed irritably against the polished table in the village inn, his lips set in a hard line. When Miss Marple arrived, he barely looked up. "If you've come to ask me whether I killed Henry Forsythe, the answer is no," he said, his voice sharp. "I expect that will save us both some time." Miss Marple gave a pleasant smile and took a seat opposite him. "Oh, I never ask such direct questions, Mr. Carraway. They seldom produce honest answers." Carraway let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is that so?" He leaned back, folding his arms. "Well then, what is it you do want?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with care. "A better understanding of your relationship with Mr. Forsythe." Carraway's jaw tightened. "There was no relationship. We were business associates once. That was years ago." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, I understand you visited him the day before his death. That does suggest unfinished business." His fingers stilled. "That wasn't a social visit, was it?" She added gently. Carraway exhaled sharply. "No, it wasn't." His eyes darkened. "Forsythe owed me." "Ah," Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You mean financially?" Carraway gave a bitter smile. "I mean legally. Forsythe was clever, you know. Too clever. He drafted agreements that looked fair on paper, but were designed to ruin men like me." He shook his head. "Years ago, we invested in a property deal together. He manipulated the terms, and in the end, I was left with nothing." He walked away, untouched. Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic. "And you never sought legal recourse?" "Oh, I tried." Carraway's voice was tight. "But Forsythe always knew how to keep his dealings just on the right side of the law. I had no proof, no leverage. And even if I had," he gestured vaguely, "who in this village would take my word over his?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "So when you visited him, what was it you wanted?" Carraway's gaze flickered. "I wanted him to set things right." "And did he?" His lips curled bitterly. "Of course not." Miss Marple studied him. "You were seen arguing." Carraway let out a dry chuckle. "Yes, I imagine we were. I told him I knew exactly what he had done, that I wasn't going to let it go. And do you know what he did?" Miss Marple shook her head. Carraway leaned forward, his voice low. He laughed. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she noted the way his hands had tightened into fists. "He said I was a fool," Carraway continued. "That if I wanted my money back, I'd have to prove he had ever stolen it in the first place." His jaw worked. "He told me I had nothing. That I'd always have nothing." There was a long silence. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was gentle. "That must have been very frustrating." Carraway exhaled sharply. "You think I killed him over that?" He let out a bark of laughter. "If I wanted him dead, I wouldn't have used poison. That's a coward's weapon." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She merely observed him, noting the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Tell me," she said, after a pause, "was there anything else? Anything unusual about his behavior that day?" Carraway frowned. Considering, he did seem distracted. Kept looking at a letter on his desk. Miss Marple's interest piqued. "A letter?" Carraway nodded. "I couldn't see much of it, but it had him rattled." He folded it away before I could get a good look. Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against the table. And after your argument? Carroway's expression darkened again. I left. There was no point wasting my breath. Forsyth was never going to change. Miss Marple took a moment before speaking again. You said something interesting earlier, Mr. Carroway. He arched a brow. Oh, she smiled. That if you wanted him dead, you wouldn't have used poison. Carroway smirked. I don't have the patience for something so delicate. Miss Marple's voice remained light. And yet, poison was the method chosen, which suggests that whoever did it had a very specific intention. Carroway's smirk faded slightly. Meaning? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Meaning it wasn't just about revenge. A pause. Carroway studied her, as if trying to decide how much to say. Then, finally, he exhaled. There's something else, he admitted. Miss Marple waited. When I left Forsyth's house, I passed by the study window. Just before I turned the corner, I saw someone inside. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Who? Carroway hesitated. I only caught a glimpse. But I swear I saw Dr. Graves standing by Forsyth's desk. Miss Marple's mind whirred. She rose to her feet, gathering her handbag. Thank you, Mr. Carroway. You have been most helpful. Carroway arched a brow. So does that mean I'm off your suspect list? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I never keep lists, Mr. Carroway. But I do believe you've given me something rather interesting to think about. She left the inn, her mind already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. Dr. Graves had insisted he had no reason to visit Forsyth that night. But if Carroway was telling the truth, then the good doctor had just become far more interesting. Chapter 5. The woman who saw Tumakaliner Whitcomb was not easily rattled. A woman of 73, with sharp eyes and a mind to match. She had spent a lifetime observing the comings and goings of little Harding from the comfort of her sitting room window. It was, she often said, the best way to understand people by watching them when they believed no one was looking. That was precisely why Miss Marple had come to visit her. Eleanor greeted her with a wary expression. I don't see why the police need to keep badgering me, she said, leading Miss Marple into her drawing room. I've already told them what I saw. Miss Marple settled into the chair offered to her. I rather suspect you have told them what you wish them to believe you saw, she said mildly. Eleanor's hand stilled over the teapot. For a fraction of a second, her face remained unreadable before she let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, you are sharp, aren't you? Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. I do try. Eleanor sighed, pouring the tea. Very well. What is it you want to know? Miss Marple studied her carefully. You claim to have seen someone outside Forsyth Manor on the night of the murder. Eleanor nodded. That's right. I saw a shadow move past the study window. A man, I think, though I couldn't make out his face. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And yet, when asked again, you said you might have been mistaken. Eleanor's lips pressed together. I wasn't mistaken, she said finally. Then why say so? Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. Because it's not always wise to get involved, she muttered. Miss Marple tilted her head. But surely, in a case of murder, Eleanor cut her off with a sharp look. You don't know everything, Miss Marple. There are secrets in this village, old secrets. Some are best left buried. Miss Marple took a measured sip of her tea. Ah, so it was someone you recognized then. Eleanor's expression flickered, but she said nothing. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice gentle but insistent. You keep a journal, don't you? Eleanor's eyes snapped up. Who told you that? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I have my ways. And I rather imagine a woman such as yourself would find great pleasure in recording the things she observes. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. You're relentless. Miss Marple said nothing, simply watching. After a long pause, Eleanor. reached into a side drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She ran a hand over the cover before opening it and flipping to a marked page. "I don't know if this means anything," she murmured, "but I wrote this down 2 weeks ago." Miss Marple leaned forward as Eleanor read aloud, "Secrets lie in Forsyth Manor. If the past is unearthed, more than one man will fall." A heavy silence followed. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was quiet. "And who exactly was meant to fall?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she closed the journal. "Henry Forsyth was planning something. I don't know what. But he spoke to Dr. Graves, and after that, he wasn't quite the same." Miss Marple's fingers tapped against her teacup. "Dr. Graves?" Eleanor nodded. "He visited Forsyth a fortnight ago. They argued. I couldn't hear what was said, but Forsyth looked shaken afterwards." Miss Marple's mind read. "Two men. One with a history of carefully buried secrets. The other, a doctor with access to poison. And now, a witness who is unwilling to speak the full truth." "Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, "you know more than you're saying." Eleanor looked away. "Knowing things doesn't always do you much good." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "But it may do someone else a great deal of good." Eleanor exhaled slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached for her journal once more. "I wrote something else," she murmured. "The night before Forsyth died." She turned a few pages, then read aloud. "A letter delivered late. An argument in the study. And a name spoken in anger. Graves." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Eleanor closed the book. "I didn't see who brought the letter, but it unsettled Forsyth. And I'm fairly certain that name Graves wasn't spoken fondly." Miss Marple sat back, deep in thought. A late letter, a heated argument, and now a murder. Eleanor met her gaze. "Do you see why I wanted to keep quiet?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, my dear. But I rather think silence will not protect you now." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. "You think I'm in danger?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Eleanor, that you've just confirmed what I already suspected." She set down her empty teacup and rose. "And I do believe it's time I had another word with Dr. Graves." Eleanor watched her go, fingers still resting on the closed journal. Miss Marple, stepping out into the cool evening air, allowed herself a small sigh. There was more to this story, and she was getting closer. Much closer. Chapter 6. The ticking clock. Inspector Harrow's irritation was evident as he sat at his desk, flipping through his notes with short, deliberate movements. He had little patience for what he considered unnecessary interference, and Miss Marple's continued involvement in the Forsyth case was beginning to wear on him. "This is a police investigation, Miss Marple," he said, barely concealing his exasperation. "We are following the evidence." Miss Marple, seated neatly in front of him, gave a polite nod. "Oh, I'm quite sure you are, Inspector. But sometimes evidence must be properly arranged before it makes sense, don't you think?" Harrow sighed. "What exactly have you come to tell me?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I have spoken with Eleanor Whitcomb. She saw something the night of the murder, something she was reluctant to admit." Harrow's eyes flickered with mild interest. "Go on," she heard Forsyth arguing in his study the night before he died. The name Graves was mentioned. The inspector's jaw tightened. "That's a thin thread, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she admitted, "but threads have a way of leading to the truth if followed carefully." She paused before adding, "There is also the matter of a pharmacy receipt." Harrow leaned forward slightly. "What receipt?" Miss Marple opened her handbag and produced the slip of paper she had found in Dr. Graves' office. This was among the doctor's belongings. Harrow took the receipt and scanned it, his expression darkening. "A purchase for Belladonna." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Signed under an assumed name, though the handwriting is unmistakably Dr. Graves." The inspector exhaled sharply. Poison, linked directly to a suspect. That's enough to. Bring him in for questioning. Miss Marple tilted her head. If only it were that simple. Harrow frowned. Why not? Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against her handbag. Because Dr. Graves is not a fool, Inspector. If he intended to poison Forsyth, would he have left such an obvious trail? The inspector gave her a measured look. You think he was framed? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that the doctor had his own reasons to despise Forsyth. But if he had truly wanted him dead, he would have been far more careful. Harrow's expression remained skeptical, but before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. A constable entered, holding a small evidence bag. Sir, the young man said, we've received the preliminary analysis of the sugar from Forsyth's study. Harrow gestured for him to continue. There were traces of belladonna, the constable reported. It was mixed into the sugar itself. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Then the poison was placed there long before the tea was made. Harrow nodded grimly. Which means the killer planned it in advance. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. And it also means the murderer knew Forsyth's habits. That he always sweetened his tea. Harrow's fingers drummed against the desk. That narrows it down to those closest to him. The housekeeper, the doctor, or someone who had access to the study. Miss Marple nodded. Maggie Hewitt swears she did not prepare the tea. Forsyth was a man of routine. He made it himself. That means the poison had to be in place before he ever lifted the spoon. Harrow leaned back, rubbing his chin. Doctor, Graves had access to belladonna, and Forsyth was digging into his father's case. That's a strong motive. Miss Marple pursed her lips. Yet Felix Carroway swore he saw Graves inside the study that night, after the doctor claimed to have left. Harrow's expression darkened. If he was in the house, why lie about it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A question well worth asking. The inspector stood abruptly, pulling on his coat. Right, I want another word with Dr. Graves. Miss Marple rose as well. And I believe I shall pay a visit to Forsyth Manor. Once more. Harrow frowned. Looking for something in particular? Miss Marple gave him a sweet smile. Only a simple question, Inspector. Harrow sighed. Which is? Miss Marple adjusted her handbag and moved toward the door. If Mr. Forsyth always made his own tea, then how did the murderer know exactly when he would drink it? The inspector hesitated, the weight of her words settling between them. And then, without another word, Miss Marple left, the wheels in her mind turning ever faster. Chapter 7. Shadows in the safe. Maggie Hewitt hesitated at the threshold of Forsyth's study, her fingers gripping the key tightly. Miss Marple stood beside her, watching with patient interest. I don't know why you want to go through his things. Miss Marple, Maggie muttered. The inspector's already had a look. Oh, I'm sure he has, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. But sometimes one must look at things with a different perspective. Maggie exhaled, then unlocked the door. The study smelled faintly of stale tobacco and parchment, the air undisturbed since the night of Forsyth's death. Papers remained neatly arranged on the desk, save for the ones the inspector had taken. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly around the room, before settling on the large cabinet in the corner. That's safe, she said lightly. It is where Mr. Forsyth kept his most private papers, I assume? Maggie nodded, arms folded. Yes, not even I had the code. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes twinkling. And yet, it is slightly ajar. Maggie gasped. That's not possible. Miss Marple touched the handle gently. Someone has been in here since the inspector last searched. With a slow breath, she pulled the heavy door open. Inside, the safe was nearly empty save for a single folder, its edges worn and yellowing, the label read, The Graves Case. Maggie swallowed. That was what he wrote in that letter, before he died. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. Let us see what was so important that Mr. Forsyth wished to reveal it. She opened the folder, her sharp eyes scanning the documents within. There were legal statements dated decades ago, a collection of medical reports signed by Dr. Graves' father, all concerning the health of an old client. The name Joseph Whitaker appeared several times. Maggie frowned. Joseph Whitaker, I know that name. He lived here years ago, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. A wealthy man, was he not? Maggie nodded. Yes, he passed away under unusual circumstances. Miss Marple's lips pursed. And these records? They suggest he was in quite poor health at the time. Maggie hesitated. But I remember people saying he was healthy, right up until his death. Miss Marple tapped a finger against the paper. Then these records were false. Maggie's breath hitched. Dr. Graves' father. Miss Marple nodded. It seems he signed off on a report claiming Whitaker was unwell when, in truth, he was not. Maggie looked pale. But why? What did Forsythe have to do with it? Miss Marple flipped through the pages, then found a final note one written in Forsythe's own hand. She read aloud, I have been complicit in the sins of others. But silence is no longer an option. The truth about Whitaker's will must be known. Maggie's hands trembled. His will? Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Joseph Whitaker was wealthy. If his medical records claimed he was dying, someone could have had him declared mentally unfit to manage his affairs. Maggie gasped. You mean his will could have been changed? Miss Marple nodded. If someone wanted to ensure the money went elsewhere. Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. And Forsythe knew? Miss Marple touched the paper. He was involved, but perhaps not as deeply as he once thought. This letter suggests remorse. Maggie shuddered. Then someone had a reason to keep him quiet. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Yes, and they succeeded. A tense silence settled over the room. Then Maggie swallowed. Miss Marple, if Forsythe was planning to expose this, then that means... Miss Marple looked at her. That means the murderer wasn't just protecting the past. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They were protecting the present. And somewhere outside the study, unseen and unheard, someone was listening. Chapter 8. The Poisoned Spoon. Miss Marple sat in the kitchen of Forsythe Manor, hands neatly folded in her lap as Maggie Hewitt placed a tray of tea before her. The sugar bowl sat between them, untouched. I never thought to question it, Maggie murmured, staring at the delicate porcelain dish. We always used the same sugar. I refilled it from the pantry when it ran low. Miss Marple picked up a silver spoon and turned it thoughtfully in her fingers. Tell me, dear, did Mr. Forsythe have any peculiar habits when it came to his tea? Maggie frowned. Not peculiar, no. He liked it a certain way. 2 spoons of sugar, always stirred exactly 3 times. If I forgot, he'd complain. She let out a short breath. Routine meant everything to him. Miss Marple nodded. And did anyone else in the house ever use this sugar? Maggie hesitated. No, it was kept here in the study for him alone. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Then, my dear, the answer is rather obvious, isn't it? Maggie swallowed. You mean the poison was put in the sugar days before? Precisely, Miss Marple said. Whoever killed Mr. Forsythe knew he would consume it himself, without needing any outside assistance. It was not an act of impulse, but of careful, deliberate planning. Maggie's face paled. Then, the murderer had to be someone who knew his habits well. Miss Marple gave a small smile. And there aren't many who would qualify, are there? Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she glanced at the sugar bowl. You think it was me? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, my dear. You had a reason to resent Mr. Forsythe, but resentment does not always lead to murder. And if you had wished him dead, I imagine you would not have stayed so faithfully in his service all these years. Maggie sagged in relief. Then who? Miss Marple tapped a finger against the table. That is the question, isn't it? Someone had access to this room when no one was watching. Someone who had time to alter the sugar without suspicion. She paused. Tell me, did Dr. Graves ever take tea when he visited? Maggie frowned. No, I don't think so. He wasn't one for lingering. Miss Marple nodded. Yet, he was one of the few who knew the properties of belladonna intimately. Maggie shivered. So you do think it was him? Miss Marple's lips pursed. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was meant to be suspected. Maggie blinked. What do? You mean? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Dr. Graves is a careful man. If he intended to murder Mr. Forsythe, would he have left such an obvious trail, a pharmacy receipt for the very poison used? Maggie hesitated. Maybe he got careless. Miss Marple shook her head. Men like Dr. Graves do not get careless when it comes to their reputations. Which suggests one of two possibilities. Either he is innocent, or he is clever enough to frame someone else in the process. Maggie looked troubled. And if he's innocent, then who else would have wanted Forsythe dead so badly? Miss Marple took a sip of her tea before answering. Someone who had as much to lose as Dr. Graves. Maggie exhaled. The Whitaker case. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Precisely. The forged medical reports, the change in Whitakers. Well, it all suggests that more than one person had a hand in whatever happened years ago. And if Forsythe was about to reveal the truth, then the murderer had every reason to act before he could do so. Maggie's face darkened. But Dr. Graves was the only one with access to belladonna. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Oh, my dear, belladonna is not so difficult to come by. A person with the right connections, the right knowledge, could obtain it without ever setting foot in a pharmacy. Maggie frowned. Then who? Miss Marple set down her cup and stood. That, my dear, is what I intend to find out. She stepped toward the door, then hesitated. One more thing, she said lightly. Who else, apart from you, ever entered this kitchen unobserved? Maggie looked startled. No one, at least not that I saw, Miss Marple smiled. I rather thought you might say that. She left the kitchen, her thoughts swirling. If the poison had been placed in the sugar beforehand, then someone had anticipated the moment Forsythe would take his tea, which meant that, whoever the murderer was, they had been waiting. They had known, without a shadow of a doubt, that Forsythe's death would come at precisely the right moment. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was not merely an act of desperation. It was an execution. Chapter 9. Eleanor's secret journal. Leonor Whitcomb did not look pleased to see Miss Marple standing at her doorstep again. You've a habit of turning up uninvited, she muttered, stepping aside nonetheless. I suppose you'll want more tea. Miss Marple entered without hesitation, her sharp eyes taking in the sitting room's orderly state. Eleanor was a woman who thrived on control. Orderly lace curtains, carefully arranged books, not a speck of dust out of place. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that those who kept their homes in perfect order often had the most to hide. No tea this time. My dear, Miss Marple said kindly. Only a little chat. Eleanor let out a sigh, lowering herself into a chair opposite Miss Marple. I don't see what more I can tell you. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Oh, I rather think you do. You keep a journal, Eleanor. A most fascinating one, I imagine. Eleanor's fingers switched slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. You've been prying. Not at all, Miss Marple said lightly. But you do have a habit of writing things down. I expect it helps to make sense of the world. I quite understand. Eleanor remained silent. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. You wrote something down the night before Henry Forsythe was murdered, didn't you? A pause. Then Eleanor exhaled sharply. I don't see why it matters. Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant. Because Mr. Forsythe was murdered. For a very particular reason. And I believe your journal might contain the key to understanding why. Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. You overheard something that night, didn't you? Eleanor hesitated, then rose stiffly and crossed the room to a small wooden writing desk. She pulled out a leather-bound book and thumbed through the pages. Before stopping on one dot, she handed the journal to Miss Marple. "Read it then, but don't say I didn't warn you." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read aloud. A letter delivered late. An argument in the study, and a name spoken in anger Graves. Miss Marple looked up. "And you're certain of this?" Eleanor gave a slow nod. "I was taking a walk. I saw the postboy leave an envelope at Forsyth's door. Not long after, I heard raised voices from the study." Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against the book. "And the name Graves, are you sure Forsyth was speaking of Dr. Lionel Graves?" Eleanor's expression remained grim. "Who else would it be?" Miss Marple studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Quite right." Eleanor let out a sigh. "If you're thinking the doctor poisoned him, I wouldn't be so sure." Whatever was in that letter shook Forsyth. He was furious, but also afraid. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Afraid of Dr. Graves?" Eleanor hesitated. "Perhaps, but I wonder." She pressed her lips together. Forsyth was always careful. If he was truly frightened, he would have acted quickly. The fact that he sat in that study all night tells me something else was at play. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He was weighing his options. Eleanor gave a tight smile. "Exactly." Miss Marple thought for a moment, then asked, "Eleanor, do you remember Joseph Whittaker?" Eleanor's lips thinned. That name again. Miss Marple watched her closely. "I suspect his will was altered fraudulently with the help of false medical reports. And I also suspect that Henry Forsyth knew it." Eleanor let out a quiet breath. "You'd be right about that." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then you know who benefited." Eleanor hesitated before nodding. "Yes, and if Forsyth had decided to expose it, there would have been more than one person willing to stop him." Miss Marple studied her, then said softly, "Eleanor, my dear, I believe you know exactly who killed Henry Forsyth." A heavy silence filled the room. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly against the arm of her chair. "You think I would protect a murderer?" Miss Marple's gaze was kind. "I think you have spent a lifetime knowing things best left unsaid." Eleanor let out a bitter chuckle. "And look where it has got me." Miss Marple closed the journal gently. "Eleanor, if you truly wish to see justice done, now is the time." Eleanor looked away for a long moment. Then finally she spoke. "There was another name in that argument, Miss Marple." Miss Marple leaned in. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Carroway." Miss Marple felt the pieces fall into place. Felix Carroway. And now she knew exactly where she needed to go next. Chapter 10. The accusation. Felix Carroway sat at the corner table of the village inn, his fingers drumming lightly against his glass. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Well, if it isn't our village detective," he said, tipping his head. "Come to accuse me of something, have you?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Not at all, Mr. Carroway. I merely hoped for a little chat." Carroway exhaled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I do hope it's not about Forsyth again. I've had quite enough of that business." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him. "I think perhaps you haven't had quite enough." Carroway's fingers stilled. "Meaning?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Mr. Forsyth had a safe in his study, you know. Inside, he kept records, very old records. And at the very top of the pile, there was a note he wrote before he died." Carroway raised an eyebrow. "And what did this note say?" Miss Marple met his gaze. It mentioned an old case, a legal matter involving a man named Joseph Whittaker. Something flickered in Carroway's eyes. He reached for his drink, took a slow sip, then set it down carefully. "I fail to see how that concerns me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But it does, doesn't it?" Carroway let out a short laugh. "You think I killed Forsyth over a case from years ago?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She simply watched him. After a moment, Carraway's smirk faded slightly. Even if I did have something to lose, poisoning a man isn't my style. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. But arranging things so another man would take the blame, now that is something else entirely. Carraway's fingers curled slightly against the table. That's a dangerous accusation. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Only if it's true. A tense silence stretched between them. Then Carraway exhaled, leaning back. You're a sharp woman, Miss Marple. But you're also wrong. Oh, he nodded. I had no reason to kill Forsyth. Miss Marple's voice was calm. But you did have a reason to ensure that Dr. Graves looked guilty. Carraway's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Henry Forsyth was preparing to reveal the truth about Whitaker's will. That meant exposing not only Dr. Graves' father, but also the man who benefited from the fraud. Carraway's expression remained unreadable. And who was that? Miss Marple smiled. Why, you, of course. Carraway let out a dry chuckle. That's quite the theory. Miss Marple's tone remained light. It's more than a theory. Eleanor Whitcomb heard Forsyth arguing with someone the night before he died. The names Graves and Carraway were both mentioned. Carraway's fingers twitched. Miss Marple continued. You knew Forsyth was about to expose you. And so you acted first. You poisoned the sugar in his study and left just enough of a trail to lead suspicion to Dr. Graves. Carraway shook his head. And where's your proof? Miss Marple smiled again. I imagine it's in the one place you haven't checked yet. Carraway frowned. And where's that? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Why, in Forsyth's will, of course. A beat of silence. Carraway's jaw clenched. Miss Marple stood, gathering her handbag. I do believe, Mr. Carraway, that you have a very difficult conversation ahead of you. And with that, she turned and left, leaving Felix. Carraway gripping his glass just a little too tightly. Chapter 11. The final clue. Inspector Harrow stood in the drawing room of Forsyth Manor, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of irritation and reluctant intrigue. Around him, the key figures in the case had gathered: Dr. Lionel Graves, Felix, Carraway, Maggie Hewitt, and Eleanor Whitcomb. Miss Marple sat comfortably in an armchair, her knitting needles clicking lightly before she set them down with an air of finality. You have gathered us all here for a reason. I presume, Miss Marple, the inspector said gruffly. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Oh yes, Inspector. The time has come to put all the pieces together. Felix Carraway scoffed, leaning back in his chair. This should be amusing. Miss Marple turned her attention to him. Indeed, Mr. Carraway, though I imagine you will find it less so by the time I am done. Carraway's smirk faltered slightly, but he said nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Henry Forsyth was murdered because of an old crime. One that involved deception, fraud, and ultimately, greed. Dr. Graves stiffened. You mean the Whitaker case? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Doctor. Joseph Whitaker's will was altered based on falsified medical reports, declaring him unfit. His fortune, I believe, was redirected in a rather suspicious manner. She turned to Carraway. And who was the principal beneficiary of that change, Mr. Carraway? Carraway's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. Ah, but Forsyth had only recently decided to correct his past mistakes, Miss Marple said mildly. He was going to reveal the fraud, and so he had to be stopped. Maggie let out a shaky breath. So the killer was. Miss Marple lifted a hand. Let us consider how it was done, shall we? The poison belladonna was placed in the sugar well before Forsyth made his own tea. That required knowledge of his precise habits. And of course, access to the study. She looked at Inspector Harrow. And who, Inspector, did Felix Carraway claim to have seen inside Forsyth's study the night of the murder? Harrow frowned. Dr. Graves. Dr. Graves bristled. That's absurd. I was never, Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And yet, what better way to divert suspicion than to make sure someone else appeared to be in the right place at the wrong time? Graves opened his mouth to protest but hesitated. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. Carroway's claim was a convenient one. Too convenient. After all, what better way to frame someone than to say you saw them where the crime occurred? Felix. Carroway's fingers twitched. This is ridiculous. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Oh, I don't think so. She reached into her handbag and produced a slip of paper. You see, Mr. Forsythe did something rather clever before he died. He left a clue. She handed the paper to Inspector Harrow. It was a partial note, written in Forsythe's handwriting. It was always, Miss Marple tapped her chin. Now, what do you suppose that means? Felix Carroway went very still. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Mr. Forsythe knew he was in danger. He was trying to tell us who had betrayed him all those years ago. She turned to Carroway, her voice unwavering. And that person was you. Heavy silence filled the room. Carroway let out a low breath. You have no proof. Miss Marple smiled again. Oh, I rather think I do. You see, Mr. Forsythe may not have finished that note, but he did something else. He wrote a letter to his solicitor the day before he died. A letter instructing him to release the full records of the Whitaker case, including the names of everyone involved if anything were to happen to him. Inspector Harrow's eyes gleamed. And I suppose you know where this letter is? Miss Marple gave a satisfied nod. Why, yes, Inspector. It was recovered from the solicitor's office this morning. Carroway's face darkened. This is nonsense. Miss Marple studied him. Is it? Carroway's hands clenched against the arms of his chair. Even if Forsythe intended to expose the past, I had no reason to kill him. Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. Oh, but you did. Forsythe had no intention of simply exposing the past. He was going to reverse it. He was preparing to contest the will, return the fortune to its rightful heirs. Eleanor let out a quiet gasp. He was undoing everything. Miss Marple nodded. And so, Mr. Carroway, you did what you always do. You acted first. A muscle twitched in Carroway's jaw. This is all speculation. Miss Marple sighed. Then perhaps you'd care to explain why the pharmacy receipt, the one used to frame Dr. Graves, was purchased using your late father's old account? Carroway's expression froze. Inspector Harrow's eyes darkened. So that's how you got the poison. Miss Marple gave a small nod. A simple trick, but effective. It pointed suspicion in the right direction while you remained safely in the background. Carroway's face was pale now. You can't prove I placed the poison in the sugar, Miss Marple smiled. Ah, but I don't need to. I only need to prove you had the most to lose. Inspector Harrow stepped forward. That'll do, Carroway. A long silence followed. Then, at last, Felix Carroway exhaled, his lips curling in something like resignation. Well, Miss Marple, you've certainly made things difficult. Miss Marple's voice was kind. Only for those who prefer their secrets to remain buried. The room was silent as Harrow signaled to his constables. As they stepped forward, Felix Carroway's expression remained unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that told Miss Marple he had known this moment would come, and perhaps, in some way, he had always feared it. Miss Marple watched as he was led away. Then, with a small satisfied sigh, she picked up her knitting once more. Justice, after all, had been served, but there was still one final piece left to place, and she intended to do just that. Chapter 12. The confession and justice served. Village of Little Harding was quieter than usual. The arrest of Felix Carroway had sent ripples through the community, and the air felt thick with speculation. Inside Forsythe Manor, Miss Marple sat comfortably in the drawing room, watching as Inspector Harrow paced the floor. Well, Harrow muttered, rubbing his chin, Carroway isn't talking much. He claims he was forced into action, whatever that means. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps because he knew the past was catching up with him. Maggie Hewitt, standing near the fireplace, let out a breath. It's still difficult to believe. Eleanor Whitcomb, seated nearby, gave a wry smile. Is it though? A man like Carroway always lands on his feet, or so he thought. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The truth has a way of surfacing, my dear. Inspector Harrow exhaled. It's all rather neat, I'll give you that, but we still need more, Miss Marple smiled. Oh, Inspector, I believe we already have it. Harrow frowned. Do we? Miss Marple nodded. You see, Mr. Forsyth had indeed prepared a final will. One that would have restored Joseph Whittaker's rightful heirs. Maggie's eyes widened. But I thought he never signed it. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out a sealed document. That is what we were meant to believe, but I had a feeling Mr. Forsyth, for all his faults, was not a careless man. He did sign it, he simply hid it away, knowing it would only be safe if certain parties never found it. Inspector Harrow took the document, peeling it open carefully. His eyes scanned the contents, and he let out a low whistle. So he really was changing everything back, Miss Marple nodded. And Felix Carroway could not afford for that to happen. Eleanor crossed her arms. So what happens now? Harrow sighed. Carroway will stand trial. With this will, there will be no question of his motive. Maggie hesitated, then spoke. And what about Dr. Graves? Miss Marple turned to the doctor, who had been standing quietly by the window. I believe an apology is in order, Dr. Graves. Graves exhaled, rubbing his temple. I should have known Carroway was trying to set me up. Miss Marple smiled gently. It is not always easy to see the truth when you are standing too close to it. Inspector Harrow turned to Miss Marple. And what will you do now? Miss Marple picked up her knitting with a small, satisfied smile. Oh, I imagine I shall return to my niece's cottage. There's still quite a bit of mending to be done. Eleanor let out a chuckle. And here I thought you might have grown tired of solving murders. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. My dear, one never quite grows tired of setting things right. The room fell into a comfortable silence. Justice had been served, the past had been corrected, and the secrets of Sycamore Lane were finally laid to rest. But as Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her hands working rhythmically over her knitting needles, she could not help but wonder how many more secrets lay waiting to be uncovered. She had a feeling she would not have to wait long to find out.